Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. It is Sunday night, April 14th, 2024, and my name's Glenn Rawson. The title of this devotional tonight is, I think, kind of fun. It's called Chicken Stealers and Hogs Thieves. So I hope you enjoy it. Hey, thank you for joining me tonight. I keep moving around to different places still, and so that's the reason for the backdrop tonight. I just wanted to let you know, I wanted to announce May 7th, 2025. May 7th, 2025, I will be taking a church history group all the way from Palmyra to Nauvoo. In fact, we're going to do 3 tours, starting in Philadelphia and going by bus and airplane all the way to Nauvoo and then home from St. Louis. These 3 tours, these 3 church history tours, are with Fun for Less Tours. So if you'd like to come on the full meal deal of church history, all the way from the beginnings of the church in Palmyra and Fayette, all the way to Nauvoo and the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith, come with me. May 7th is the first tour, May 7th, 2025, and I will be out there for over a month doing 3 tours back to back. And they are selling so quickly that even the first tour is almost sold out. So if you're interested in coming with me, beginning May 7th, 2025, funforlesstours.com. Call Fun for Less. I'd love to have you come. And again, as always, tonight, I invite you to make a comment. Let me know how many's watching, where you're watching from. It's fascinating to me that you're all over the world and that so many of you are watching, and you need to know I am honored that you would take that time and spend that time with me. In that regard, also, thank you to all those of you that are VIPs. Quite a number of you signed up to be VIPs this last week, and I am grateful to you for that financial support. Thank you for that help. But also, thank you to all those of you that are receiving the free weekly stories. Someday remind me, and I'll tell you the whole story of why we're doing this. I've been telling stories now since 1995, even before that, I guess, and it's always been something I've done as a public service. There's a story behind that, which I will tell you one of these days. But for those of you that are willing to share those stories with someone else, family members, friends, and so forth, the stories we send out weekly are free. You're free to share them with anybody. I'm not territorial. Share them with anyone and everyone if it will help them. And one last thing. You'll remember a few months ago that I told you I was collecting stories about prayer. Well, I am ready now to start the final draft of that book about the prayers of the saints. And if you have stories about prayer, not just pioneer stories from the past, but stories of your own experiences, of what you've learned about prayer, then if you don't mind sharing them with me, please send those stories to support@glennrawsonstories.com, or you can send them directly to me, glenn@glennrawsonstories.com. Again, I am looking now to finish the last draft of this book about prayer. And if you have stories, particularly stories of your own testimony experiences about prayer and answers to prayer, or the doctrine of prayer, send them to support@glennrawsonstories.com or to glenn@glennrawsonstories.com. All right, I'm ready to begin. I have 6 stories to share with you tonight, and I pray for the Spirit of the Lord. I want to have fun. I want to laugh with you, but I want to share the Spirit of the Lord. So let's begin with the title story, Chicken Stealers and Hog Thieves. And believe it or not, this story is written to those who think it's not that big of a deal to criticize and speak ill of the Lord's servants and of the Lord's church. This story is written for those who just don't think that's all that important. Abraham Owen Smoot was born February 17th, 1815 in Owen County, Kentucky. From the time of his childhood, Abraham was a sickly child, and at one point so low that it seemed that his death was imminent. Well, as Abraham grew, the passion also grew with Abraham to know if the Lord had a true church on the earth. Along the way, he investigated various denominations, but he said he could never feel satisfied. Well, at the age of 19, he was introduced to the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, and though still sickly, he was baptized into the church by Warren Parrish. Elder David W. Patton, later of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, confirmed him a member of the church, and while blessing him, promised him that he would be made whole of his infirmity, and he would, quote, become a powerful and a strong man. Abraham would later say that promise was verified to the letter, and Abraham said, I began to grow strong immediately. Well, not only did he recover strength in body and mind, but also in spirit. He went on from there to serve multiple missions and even as a branch president. In January 1838, he returned as a missionary to serve in the southern United States. One morning, he was preaching in the courthouse in a community called Yellsville, Arkansas, when a man in the crowd of a different denomination began to heckle him. The man continued until the assembled crowd listening, quote, ordered him to be still. Well, the man quieted down for a moment, but it didn't last. He soon, quote, broke forth in a perfect rage and denounced in a rather incoherent manner, I'm quoting, denounced in a rather incoherent manner Joe Smith and his gold Bible and the Mormons as chicken thieves and hog stealers, etc. End of quote. Well, the people had had enough of the man's ranting and rambling, and they surrounded him and were going to violently throw him out of the meeting when Abraham spoke up and asked the crowd to hold back and allow the man to withdraw peacefully. Well, as the man did, as he went out the door, Abraham warned him, quote, that if he did not speedily repent, the Lord would rebuke him and the judgments of God would soon overtake him. Evidently, that made the man even more angry, and he turned and rushed from the room, foaming with rage, Abraham said. End of quote. Well, the man ran out and began to assemble a mob with the intent of attacking Abraham. Others that were there threatened him with arrest that if he did so. So he backed down, but he continued his angry rage against, quote, against the young preacher and everything connected with him, end of quote. And here it is. This is the reason I tell you the story. This angry anti-Mormon running about the community, raging against Abraham Smoot. Abraham describes how the man returned to his home, and I quote, and on entering his house, almost immediately fell dead and turned black. In this condition, the man lay for 2 days, no one, not even his own sons, daring to go anywhere near him, end of quote. A week later, the man's wife also died. And it didn't end there. Calamity continued to befall the family until it was the conclusion of the townspeople that the judgment of God had fallen on that man and his family. Wow. Kind of reminds you of Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts, doesn't it? Now, I don't know what to make of that story, but I believe that Abraham was telling the truth. And I share it as a stern warning to all of those who fight against the work of the Lord and slander and defame his authorized servants. Now, they may not turn black and fall down dead in a moment, although that has happened, according to the historical record, a number of times. But those who rage against the work of the Lord, well, their fate will inevitably, in the end, be just as awful. So, be warned. Be warned. Next story. Sarah Ann Mercer was born in Allerton, Yorkshire, England, December 8, 1815. She grew up in a poor family and went to work at a very young age to support her family. She married Charles Wilkinson when she was about 18 years of age, and it is said at the time they were the handsomest couple in town. Well, in time, 1842, Charles and Sarah joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and soon, like so many others, were filled with the spirit of the gathering and wanted to come to America. Even their son, now they were poor, so even their 8-year-old son, Joseph, went to work in the coal mines to earn enough money for ship's passage so that the family could come. But as the years advanced, there was just never enough money to pay for that. 13 years passed, and still the family did not have sufficient means to make the journey. So, desperately, June 3rd, 1856, Father Charles and his son William set sail for America, leaving the rest of the family in England. The idea being that Father and the oldest boy would go to America, earn enough money where they could make more money, and they would send it back to bring the family on. Sarah was left behind in England with 8 children to care for and another one on the way. She did everything she could to provide, taking in washing and whatever else she could do to bolster their travel fund. But after a year, there was still not enough. Sarah decided they needed a greater power to help them. They needed a miracle. According to family records, quote, that night at prayer, she asked the children to each ask Heavenly Father for guidance in the matter. She led out, and then the oldest boy was told to follow her. But as the oldest boy started to pray, Sarah stopped him, told him that he didn't have to make that request, that he should only thank the Lord, for the plan had come to her as she prayed. End of quote. The very next day, Sarah Ann Mercer sent her son Moses down to the docks to learn when the next immigrant ship, would set sail for Boston. Once he learned that, then the boy was told to write a letter to his father and let him know that the whole family would be on that ship the next time it went to Boston. Then Sarah, dressed in her finest clothes, dropped her children off with her mother, and then taking one little boy with her, she went to the home of one of her wealthiest clients for whom she did laundry. When she came to the front door, the maid of the house directed her to the servants' entrance around the back. But Sarah insisted that she wanted to see the master of the house on important business. Well, strangely, the master of the house did come, and Sarah explained her plight, asking him for a letter of recommendation that she could present as she went from house to house asking for help to emigrate to America. Not only did the man receive her, write her that favorable recommendation, but then he gave her a generous donation as well. Every day that she could, Sarah was obedient to her prayer and went from house to house asking for help. When the Margaret Tyson sailed from Liverpool in August 1857, Sarah and all of her children were on that ship, just as they had promised. She had earned enough money and to spare. She reunited with Charles and William in America, and together the whole family came on to Zion, where they lived out the rest of their days in Hoytsville, Utah. Today, their posterity calls them blessed for their sacrifices to reach Zion, of which I am one. Sarah is my third great-grandmother. Next story. This story is directed to those of you who just don't think you are all that important in the work of the Lord. You have a testimony, you go to church every Sunday, you hold a temple recommend, but you're just not anything all that important in your own estimation. This story's for you. Sometime just previous to the dedication of the Kirtland House of the Lord in March 1836, a series of meetings was held in the temple in which those who had labored to help build that temple were called to receive a special priesthood blessing under the hands of Joseph Smith and the First Presidency. Now, there was a lad there watching all of those meetings, Benjamin Franklin Johnson. He stood at the doorway and listened to those choice blessings given to each of those people who had worked on the temple. He described, and I quote, feeling great joy in these prophetic words that filled and almost thrilled me, he said. Now, Benjamin assumed that those blessings were reserved only for those who had labored with their hands in the building of the temple, which, of course, he was unable to do, being too young and too weak for that kind of work. He hadn't done it. He wrote, quote, "It grieved me exceedingly to think that perhaps through my neglect I was to be deprived of that which to me appeared of more worth than all earthly things." End of quote. Meaning, he was not going to get a blessing under the hands of the prophet Joseph. Well, Benjamin continued watching until the very last blessing was given out for those who had worked on the temple. And at the conclusion of that last blessing, Benjamin records that the prophet Joseph turned and earnestly looked toward the door where Benjamin was standing, and then said to his brother Hiram, "Go and see if there is not one more to be blessed," Joseph said. Hiram came to the door, saw Benjamin, placed a hand on his shoulder, and asked if Benjamin had worked on the temple. And Benjamin responded by saying, "No, sir," which he said, in his words, seemed like passing a sentence upon my fondest hopes. End of quote. But Hiram didn't turn away. Rather, he asked again if there wasn't anything that Benjamin had done to further the work on the house. When Benjamin suddenly remembered that he had earned a new gun, which gun he had taken and donated to the temple committee. And then he remembered that along the way, he'd helped make a few bricks for the temple. So he said, Well, I did give a gun. Whereupon Hiram responded by saying, I thought there was a blessing for you. End of quote. And then Benjamin said, he almost carried me to the stand. Benjamin received that coveted blessing. And in it, not only was he blessed with things he couldn't even imagine, but his patriarchal promises were confirmed as well. Benjamin called this a high privilege, and he wrote, my joy was full. He said, gratitude filled his soul. The Lord had respect for his greatest desire, even to be the youngest and the last one to be blessed, he said. Now, I've thought a great deal about that story. In fact, it came to me while I was sitting in church today that story is very, very powerful. Benjamin's gifts to the work of the Lord, well, I wouldn't exactly say they were ordinary. He didn't build the pulpits. He didn't erect the steeple. He donated a gun for the building of the temple. And he made a few bricks, which evidently didn't even get used. You see, maybe your gifts to the Lord are not huge sums of tithing money or offerings. Or maybe you haven't along the way served as the bishop, the stake president, the Relief Society president, or any other great and notable calling. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. As Joseph called Benjamin, God Almighty will call you. The Lord has a promise and a blessing for you and respect for your offering as well. The day will come, if you are true and faithful, when the Lord will call you up and bless you for your service, even and if all you were able to do, figuratively speaking, was make a few bricks. And even if you're the last one called, it will be worth it. Well, I'm sorry I can't help the music that's pounding beneath my feet, but I hope you can't hear it. Can't control the neighbors. Let's take a break. Are you doing okay? I pray that you are well. This coming July, Dennis Lyman and I are still going on that Great American and Cowboy Tour. I was just on KSL the other day talking about it. It's coming forth. We will have a great tour. And if you love the cowboys of the Old West, you're going to love this tour. If you would like to go on that tour, please write to me, Glenn, at glennrawsonstories.com, and I can hook you up with the right people. Next story. This was given to me by a friend, but it turns out I had written this story many, many years ago. This comes from an Ensign article written in 1991. And ironically, whether it's tax time or test time for students, the story is applicable. May I share this story with you, which I hope will speak for itself. Many years ago, there lived a school teacher in Arizona named Jane Frost. And whether it was English or honesty, for 2 generations, this teacher placed an indelible stamp on the minds and consciences of her students. Now, some would say it wasn't just her commanding skills as a teacher, but also the ominous presence of the pine wood paddle that legend held she had used on the backside of more than one hard-headed student. You would expect in their little town that the young people would sit up and pay attention when she walked by. But when she walked down the aisles of the market, even the mothers stopped lollygagging and tended to business. Well, one year, Lainey and Sarah decided to test those fences. Mrs. Frost handed the class the exam, and with the paddle in hand, warned them all that cheating was dishonest and would not be tolerated. The class settled into the exam, and Mrs. Frost settled deep into a book of poetry, which she was thoroughly enjoying. Sarah was struggling through the exam when she felt a sweaty piece of paper pushed into her hand, and she looked up to see if Mrs. Frost had seen the transfer. Ah, she hadn't. She was still smiling over her poetry. Lainey opened up the paper. Her blood ran cold. It was all the answers to the test, straight from the teacher's manual. With a quick glance to the front, she set to work again. And strangely enough, Lainey and Sarah were the first ones done with the exam. The bell rang, and they were excused. And thus began the longest weekend of two guilty girls' lives. Later that night, Lainey awoke from a horrible nightmare. All of her stuffed animals, their faces had been replaced by the face of Mrs. Frost. And on her bedroom wall, John, Paul, George, and Ringo had been replaced with the gap-toothed grin of, yep, you guessed it, Mrs. Frost. Lainey and Sarah were haunted by the specter of Mrs. Frost all weekend long, until finally Sarah turned to Lainey and said, "What are we going to do? What choice do we have? We either die of guilt or we face the pine wood paddle." Lainey responded, "Well, judgment held no greater dread than the ringing of the bell Monday afternoon. Two girls had to stop who could scarcely stop hyperventilating. They found themselves in front of Mrs. Frost's desk. "We cheated on the test Friday," Lainey blurted out. "We felt like dirt. We're so sorry." "Please forgive us," Sarah said. Well, Mrs. Frost complimented them for their courage and then said, "But you have made a sad mistake and must suffer the consequences." End quote. She then dropped their test papers in the garbage can, and with the paddle in hand, brought them to opposite sides of her massive oak desk and commanded them to bend way over and shut their eyes. In anxious terror, they waited to see who would get the paddle first, and then Lainey heard it. Whap! Sarah got it first. Sarah began to whimper, which started Lainey sniffling. Then Sarah started to cry. Whap! Sarah got it again. Oh, it sounded wicked. Sarah was sobbing now, and Lainey joined in. Whap! It came again. Another one to Sarah. Now both girls were wailing. Lainey couldn't stand it anymore. She cried out, "Please stop, Mrs. Frost. Sarah, are you all right?" Simultaneously, both girls opened their eyes and looked at each other. Red-faced and soggy, Sarah answered, "What do you mean, am I all right? You're the one getting hit." As they stared at each other in confusion, whap! Mrs. Frost took one more swing with that infamous paddle and knocked more dust from the seat of her padded desk chair. How many of those mock massacres had occurred in the last 30 years with some dishonest students? No one would ever know. At least not from Lainey and Sarah, who joined the secret society of loyal admirers who would keep her secrets and her lessons locked in their hearts the rest of their lives and into eternity. It was once said something like this: "The wicked flee when no man pursueth." I hope, you and I, that our integrity is worth more than any guilt-laden advantage dishonesty might bring. it is worth it to me. What is the law of consecration? And what exactly is it? How does it work? Well, I'm sure there's a lot more to it than either one of us understand, but maybe this story will help. Thomas Grover was born July 22nd, 1807, in Whitehall, New York. His father died before he was born, which necessitated Thomas from a very early age having to go to work as a cabin boy on an Erie canal boat. 8 years later, Thomas would work his way up to become captain of the canal boat called the Shamrock. Well, along the way, he married Carolyn Whiting, and in 1828, he moved to Freedom, New York, where he took up farming. Now, in 1833 and 1834, the prophet Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon spent considerable time in and around Freedom, that area, preaching the gospel. The Lord had revealed to Joseph, quote, "I have much people in this place and in the regions round about," section 100, verse 3. Well, it is likely that Thomas was one of those who heard the prophet Joseph preach, and his heart was touched. 6 months later, Thomas and Carolyn were baptized as members of the church. On March 15th, 1835, following his baptism, Thomas sold his farm in Freedom, New York for $500 and set out for Kirtland, Ohio to gather with the saints. On arriving in Kirtland, Thomas declared that he wanted to go meet the prophet Joseph Smith. The following is recorded from family records, and I quote, "As he knocked on the door, the prophet Joseph opened that door and put out his hands. How do you do, Brother Grover? If God ever sent a man, he sent you." And then Joseph said, "I want to borrow every dollar you can spare for immediate use." Yeah. You imagine being greeted at the door like that? Well, Thomas Grover entered the house, conversed with the prophet about the situation, and offered to let Joseph have whatever money he needed. Joseph accepted the offer and told Brother Grover to look around and find a location that suited him for a home and then return when the money he had advanced to Joseph would be returned to him. Well, in a short time, Thomas Grover found the place that he wanted, but he refused, and I'm quoting now, he refused to receive back his money, saying, "I have sufficient for my needs without it." From that day, the devotion of Thomas Grover to Joseph Smith never wavered. End of quote. I've lived long enough and been out in social media long enough to know that many people in the world consider it utter foolishness that faith and obedience require money, the sacrifice of worldly wealth. But from the time that Adam and Eve offered up the firstlings of their flock to the present day, when the Lord's people are asked to donate their money and themselves as offerings, it has always been so. There is a tie between the wallet and faith. And now, might I just say with conviction, any and all of you financial experts and gurus out there who are looking to make a really, really good investment with long, high, and lasting returns, please consider the example of Thomas Grover and invest in the work of the Lord. Thomas Grover consecrated not only his money that day in Kirtland, but himself to the very end of his days. That's the law of consecration. Last story for tonight. I'm not sure how many people realize this, but these two men were the great warrior kings of the Nephites. If all rulers had been, ever would be, and were like unto them, the very powers of hell that hold nations captive would be shaken forever. Sometime around 150 BC, Mosiah, the latest in a long line of Nephite kings, was warned of the Lord to leave the land of Nephi. It had been prophesied that if the Nephites did not repent, the Lamanites were about to overrun the land of Nephi. Thus Mosiah fled out of the land, taking with him as many as would hearken unto the voice of the Lord, and they departed out of the land into the wilderness. Omni 1:12 and 13. King Mosiah and his people discovered the land of Zarahemla, and they united together with the people of Zarahemla under the rule of Mosiah, who wielded the sword of Laban in their defense and the brass plates for their ministry, for the ministry and their edification and peace. And little else is known of King Mosiah the first. Our record of his reign and ministry went the way with Martin Harris and the lost 116 pages into oblivion for now in June of 1828. Well, as we do know from our existing record, King Mosiah the first was succeeded by Benjamin, his son. And in the days of King Benjamin, there was again much contention among his people, as well as war with the Lamanites. Benjamin gathered up his armies and with the sword of Laban in hand, drove the Lamanites out. Now, once King Benjamin had removed the enemy from without, he then turned on the enemy within. False Christs, false prophets, and false teachers, until finally the evil had been driven from among his own people. Along the way, King Benjamin became a holy man who reigned over his people in righteousness and labored, quote, with all the might of his body and the faculty of his whole soul until he established blessed peace among his people. King Benjamin was a servant king. He labored to support himself rather than enrich himself at their labor. He fought the addicting and enslaving elements that inevitably encroach upon civil society and destroy their freedom. He shamelessly taught his people to keep the commandments of God and refused to burden his people with himself, with taxes, or with the heavy hand of oppressive government. As he came to the very end of his reign, King Benjamin stood before his people with a clear conscience, knowing that he had served them in the love of Christ all his days. These people were his friends, his brethren, and when he invited them to come unto Christ and enter into a covenant to serve him, they came. Out of love for their king, they came, all of them. King Mosiah, King Benjamin. Oh, for such wise leaders now who lead, who really lead, who serve, and in love care for their people. Such leaders now will never be forgotten by God or their people. Is it still possible for a nation to be led by truly holy, godlike Christian men and women? Good night, and God bless.